What's up, team? Now, the time has come for you to buy your first bow. And this can be one of the most exciting periods in your archery career, just starting out, getting ready to get your own equipment. But it can also be really confusing because there's so much information out there. You know, when you look at all the archery equipment, it's really hard to know where to start when you're just starting out. And you can go and spend anything from $300 to $3,000 and above. And it's hard to kind of find that sweet spot of what you want to get, right? So in this video, what I want to do is actually walk you through step by step how I would help you piece together your first order of archery equipment. And what we're going to do in this video is actually go through an online archery shop and piece together that order as I would help you to do it. And we're going to do that on a budget and try and make sure that we get good value for money. Because what's really important when you're just starting out is you don't want to spend too much money on things that you're going to have to upgrade as you go forward anyway. And you don't want to spend not enough money on things so that it's going to force you to upgrade and you end up spending more money in the long run. So there's always a bit of like a Goldilocks zone or a sweet spot that you want to find where it's good value for money for your level and for your progression, but you can also, it's a good base of equipment that you can upgrade and continue to use and get good value out of it as you go forward. So what we're going to go through in this video is I'm set up on a website called Alt Services. Now these guys are one of the biggest online archery retailers. They're based in the UK. They're by no means the only shop. I order a lot of gear from these guys just because they have good prices, good customer service, and a really broad range. So you can pretty much get everything from one place. But there's nothing against you going to a local supplier or another international retailer to try and shop around and get better prices or support local businesses if that's your thing. So I just really wanted to show you this to show you how we can get all of our equipment from one supplier in one place. And then really, if you want to take that process and then apply it in any archery shop, it's fine by me. So without further ado, let's get stuck into it.
Okay, so here we are on the Alt Services homepage. You can see the website up above here. You can simply find these guys just by Googling Alt Services. Now, before we get into our order, we're just got to click through into their archery shop page. And what you can see is that the layout of this homepage is laid out a bit like a physical archery shop, with different areas and things to go into. Now, when we're starting our order, we want to start with the biggest and most important items to go for. So we're going to start with our bow. So if you hit the recurve section, and for pretty much all of our items today, what we're going to do is list them from low to high price so that you get a bit of a feel for where it is within the spectrum of pricing, because it can vary quite a lot. Now, the first thing you want to get is a riser. And so if you look at the menu on the left-hand side of the screen here, there's all kinds of different categories of riser. You've got beginners, formula risers. What we're going to look in is risers ILF. And ILF stands for International Limb Fitting, which is what I would generally recommend for pretty much any developing archer, because you'll be able to interchange any set of limbs, or any set of ILF limbs, I should say, with any ILF riser. And that means that as you progress, you have lots of options in terms of upgrading and creating the best equipment combinations. So as we look at these risers here, we're starting out at the very cheap end. And when you're looking at risers, there's a few things that you want to look for. Basically, the riser is the core of your bow, and so you want to try and get the best riser you can afford, because in principle, there's really no parts that will wear out on your riser, and as long as you look after it, then it should, in principle, last you for a very, very long time. And there's no practical reason why you would need to upgrade it if you get a decent one. So first of all, when you're looking at risers, especially in this cheap end, you'll notice that they're generally made of like a die-cast alloy, which is quite lightweight, a little bit brittle, and is only suitable for your lighter weight poundages. And then as we start to increase in price, you start to get a little bit more of a robust material or robust alloy that they're manufactured out of. Now, the correct one for you will depend on a few factors. So we're looking at the mass weight of the riser, so how heavy it is in your hand. And if you're like a slender build archer, or if you're particularly if you're a young archer, so someone who's like 12 or 10 years old, you really want to minimize the mass weight of the archer of the riser, sorry, because the heavier the bow, the harder it is to set the front shoulder and actually maintain technique. And at that kind of division, you're not actually shooting high poundage anyway, so you can kind of get away with some of these cheaper options because the riser's not under a lot of strain at low poundage. So a good option, for example, at the lower end is something like where was it? We went past it here before. This Crosson Zenyarizer. Now this is at the bottom end of what's something that I would recommend. And the Crosson Zenyarizer is a really basic setup, quite a good bow. It's very, very light in terms of its mass weight. So it's only 770 grams, which is one of the lightest bows on the market. However, because of the alloy, it is only suitable for your lighter poundage bows. So I would only recommend this to someone generally if they're going to be shooting less than 30 pounds. Note here that even the factory recommends a maximum of 38. So they acknowledge that, and that's good of them. I think that's pretty fair. So I've had one of my students has bought this bow, and it's actually, the build quality is not too bad. The other important thing about this bow is the price point. You're looking here at an entry price of around $130. That is dirt cheap for something of this quality riser. But if you're looking to move into competitive archery or something a little bit more robust for the long term, this is something that you would expect to upgrade. So that price point is very fair for what it is, but not suitable for everyone. Let's just say that. The next riser as we go up in price, not much, but a little bit, is the Cartel Phantom riser. Now, Cartel Phantom riser is another one that's very, very cheap in price point, and I think this is probably one of the best value bang for buck bows on the market. I've had a number of students shoot this bow, and it's actually quite good. So the weight, though, you'll notice here that is a 1200 gram riser, which is a huge jump in mass weight from the Crosson Zenyarizer riser that we were just looking at. But this is, if you're someone with a bit more of a solid build, but you're really on a budget, this is a good basic riser that could get you in at an entry-level price, and that would be more than adequate for just starting out. A couple of cool color options here. Okay, so they're some of the lower cost options, the ones that I would endorse, that are Jared endorsed. But if we look here, this is probably the realm of what I would start to recommend as we come down here a little bit into your intermediate quality risers. So these WNS risers, the Elite Forged risers, I think they're being phased out for a newer version, but they're tried and tested. I think this is what they're being replaced by. This is what they are. WNS Motive FX riser. So these are the old Seville Flute branded risers, and these have been used by developing archers very, very successfully, and have shot actually outstanding scores with these bows. So there's a couple of things that we're looking at here in a riser that has good functionality. First of all, the riser itself and the build of the riser. We've talked about that, the alloy that's used. There's also a couple of other functions. So here you can see there's these bolts. They're called the tiller bolts, and they help adjust your tiller on the bow, and you can have some small adjustment in poundage settings. And you'll also notice these little grub screw type thingies on the top or on the bottom of each limb pocket. And they are your limb alignment settings. And so these bows all have limb alignment adjustment, which is very important for your ability to tune your bow. And so I wouldn't recommend any bow without the functionality of having a limb adjustment. But this is a bow that can come in either 25 inches or 23 inches. The mass weight is very, very light again. The Crosson Zenyarizer we examined before, which is 770 grams, is pretty much the exception. But anything less than 1100 grams is considered what I would consider a very light riser. And you got some cool color options here. So if you're someone who is a developing archer, particularly a junior archer, someone who's going to be shooting up to sort of mid 30-pound range in that, in a draw weight, then this is going to be a more than adequate option for you, and I would highly endorse this. The price point for this riser is about $280, which is exceptional value when you think about the quality that you're going to get. And I've seen these bows shoot scores in excess of 1320, 1330 in its respective divisions. When you're ordering a riser, one thing that's very important to touch on is the size. Now, whether you get a 23 or a 25-inch riser. Now, there's a bit of guidance that I could give you on this, and what we're going to do is jump over to this little chart. You can find this online. If you Google how to choose the right bow length for a recurve bow, you'll come across plenty of different examples like this. This is as good as we need for this example. What you can see here is that it's a relationship between the draw length, so how far you pull back the string, and the recommended size of your bow, okay? Now, the overall size of the bow is related to the size of the riser and the size of the limbs. So let me explain that. A 25-inch riser, that would be this blue one here, and that size there. A 25-inch riser combined with short limbs would make a 66-inch bow. A 25-inch riser paired with medium limbs would make a 68-inch bow. And a 25-inch riser with long limbs would make a 70-inch bow. To make a 64-inch bow, you would need to go with short limbs and a 23-inch riser. And to make a 72-inch bow, either side on the long end of that, you would need to go with a 27-inch riser and long limbs. But for the 66, 68, and 70-inch bow size, I would always recommend generally going with a 25-inch riser. It's the most versatile, most popular, and it will have the best resale value or ability to upgrade as you go forward. And if you're anywhere from sort of that 24 inches and up in draw length, which is quite short actually, then yeah, I would still recommend the 25-inch riser, all the way up to 30 inches plus. And 25-inch riser is what I shoot as well. I shoot 25-inch riser with long limbs, which is a 70-inch bow, and my draw length is around 29.5 to 30 inches. So right in there. So let's have a look at some other options. So this is the W&S riser, and this is a really good option. Let's look at another couple of options. So all of these risers have sort of similar functionality, and this is why it can be hard to navigate these options, because after a while they all look the same, and it's a bit hard to tell the difference. Now, I want to point out one other riser which I think is particularly good value for that intermediate developing archer range, and that's the Fivix Velotor V2 riser, and we're looking at the 25-inch version here. Now, you'll notice the price point is a little bit higher. It's up around the $500 mark. But considering what we're buying here, I still think that's exceptional value. And this is a bow that I think is probably has an intermediate price, but a high-end quality finish. A couple of my students have shot this bow. This is something that I would happily shoot in competition in terms of the build quality. So again, I really like this bow because of the value. Has a lot of functionality, really high-end build quality, really high-end functionality in terms of the limb alignment and the tiller adjustability. The mass weight is really low. It's a forged and CNC machine riser, which means that it's got a combination of being forged and then CNC machined. And it's got some funky color options as well. So there you have it. I think this is the one that I would recommend. If you have money to spend, it's worth upgrading the riser first of all, because this is something that you can use and shoot for a long time. So let's start off with our Fivix Velotor riser. I'm going to get a right-hand green one and add that to cart. There we go. Now, if we go back to our archery shop here, the next thing we need in our shopping cart is limbs. So once you click on Recurve, it'll naturally take you to this home page. But what we want to do is we want to look on the left-hand column here and click on Limbs ILF. So International Limb Fitting is what it means. I'm going to sort them again from low to high. Now, this is a bit different to choosing a riser, because when you first chose a riser, you want to get something that's as good as you can afford, basically. Something that you won't have to upgrade. When you're choosing limbs, however, this is a bit of a different approach. First of all, you will have to upgrade your limbs as you develop as an archer. You'll start on a light set of limbs. And if you're a young archer and you're still growing in terms of your height and your physical development, your draw length may actually increase. So you may need to move from a 66-inch bow to a 68 and then maybe a 70, depending on how old you are when you're starting. And you'll also move up in weight of bow poundage. So you'll move from a 20-pound bow to a 26-pound bow to a 32-pound bow to a 40-pound bow, maybe. And so as you move up those progressions, you will actually need to upgrade your limbs several times. The other thing is the limbs are the bendy bits on your bow. So whilst the riser is the core of your bow, it doesn't actually wear out. The limbs over time do get worn out as you shoot them. So basically, when we're first starting out on a set of limbs, we don't want to overspend because when you're just starting out, you're not going to be shooting the Olympics with this set of limbs. You want something that you're going to learn a technique on that's relatively light and easy to use. You want something that's going to be shooting mostly short distance. And at short distance, even these moderate price limbs are actually more than adequate for shooting quite accurately. And you're going to be upgrading it in a relatively short period of time. My recommendation in terms of limb selection is pretty much exclusively this limb. This is the Cartel Phantom Edge Fiber limb. And when it comes to the limb, the price, what you're paying for is a couple of different things. You're paying for the build materials and you're also paying for the build quality. So at the cheaper end of this limb category, what you're looking at is typically limbs that are made of a wood core and have like a fiberglass laminate either side of it. As you move up in the price bracket, a couple of things can change. The core can be either wood or foam, and foam is a bit lighter weight, but there's also some high quality limbs that use a different wood core, although it's a higher quality wood core. And then you start to get into the carbon reinforced limbs, and so they will have unidirectional or cross or multi-directional carbon fiber laminates. And that's when your price really starts to ratchet up. And so at the top end of limbs here, your foam carbon core limbs, you could spend up to $800 or $1,000 on a set of limbs for your top end limbs. But for getting started out, these Cartel Phantom limbs, they're only around $100 to get a set. And that's exceptional value. So we're going to order a set of these. And for our example here, I'm going to assume your draw length is, say, 28 inches. And we're going to make a 68-inch bow. So like I said here, to make a 68-inch bow, we chose a 25-inch riser. And we're going to choose medium limbs, or in this case, it'll be 68-inch limbs. So when you're choosing the size of your limbs, you'll notice here that there's 3 different sizes, a number of different annotations actually. You've got 66, 68, and 70, and that relates to the length of the limb. The second number here is the poundage. That's how heavy they are to pull back. And for your first set of limbs, depending on who you are, I would generally recommend getting the lightest possible set that's going to help you develop your technique and build up the repetition or the volume of arrows you're shooting in a week. So we're going to choose a 68-inch bow, and I'm going to choose a set of 20-pound limbs. And I wouldn't recommend for your first bow to get anything more than typically 24 pounds. So 18 to 24 pounds depending on the archer. Let's add them to cart. There we go. So far we've got our top-notch riser, we've got a set of cheapy limbs, and we're sitting around the $570 mark. And that's pretty much our bow. We've got riser and limbs. So let's head back to the archery shop because there's about 30 things we need to buy, not just the riser and limbs. The next thing we're going to need is a string. Now, when you click on this, again, it'll take you to all kinds of string materials, but when you're just starting out, I recommend you just buy a ready-made string. You can buy custom-made strings, you can make your own, but for just starting out, these ready-made strings are more than adequate. You just want to make sure that you get a decent string material. These Dacron strings tend to be a little bit beginnery for your shooting, and so we don't even use them on our beginner bows these days. So you want something that's made out of maybe a fast flight or an 8125 string for your first string. And there's no need to spend too much because, again, you're going to wear these strings out and you're probably going to upgrade them before long. So let's choose this BSK 8125 string. Now, when you're ordering strings, order 2 of them. you want a string, and you want a spare string. You don't want to be caught with your pants down at a shoot or a competition, even in training, when your serving goes or your knocking points fall off or your string breaks a strand and then you're left stranded, excuse the pun. So you always want a spare string, and if one breaks or if one wears out, you just whip the other one on and then you have something to move forward with. You don't want to be held up because of a string that breaks. They're not that expensive. You choose the length. So in this case, we're going to go 68 inch, and always choose the 18 strand option when you're ordering a pre-made string. And add to cart. Okay, next we're going to need some of the accessories to bolt onto our bow. First thing we're going to need is a button. Now a button or a pressure button is a little device that adds to your bow that helps to set your center shot, but it's also very important for, it has a spring or that's why it's called a cushion sometimes, or a pressure button, because it has a spring mechanism inside which will help to cushion the flex of the arrow as it flies through the bow. Go and look online for videos on the Archer's Paradox to see how this works. So you can spend not much money and get a button. This Avalon Classic button is, if you're on a budget, this would be more than adequate. And you could pick one up for $10. You know, there's nothing fancy, it's not that expensive, and so you're probably not too upset if you have to upgrade it in the future. So that's one option. What I would recommend, however, is to get a button that's, you know, a little bit better. And we're going to add the Shibuya DX pressure button to the list. This is a really widely used button, really popular. You can get all kinds of colors here. So we're going to go pink because we're funky. And you see it's about $40. So this is something that I've shot for many years. There's no reason you'd need to upgrade it. It comes with a gold tip, which means that the Teflon tip doesn't get worn out. And the functionality of this button is such that you can basically adjust the spring tension and you can adjust the center shot through here. So we're going to add one of these to our cart. And that should last us for a long time, as long as we look after it. Now the next thing we're going to need is an arrow rest. Okay, now when it comes to arrow rests, again, you don't need to get too fancy here. The first thing that you could do is order one of these really basic arrow rests like this. And these are more than adequate. And actually a lot of top archers have shot these quite successfully in the past. They're only about 50 cents each. And I would always recommend adding a few of these. I'm going to put 5 in my order here because these are not very robust, but they're easy to stick on. And so even if you have a better rest and it breaks, in a competition, you can have one or two of these in your kit or in your quiver, and you can quickly whack on your bow and continue to shoot without too much fuss. So we're going to put them in just as a spare, and I'm going to come back and choose a bit more of a permanent rest that's going to do me. And we're going to look for the Shibuya rest that pairs up with that plunger we just bought. Let's have a look where it is. Here we are, Shibuya Ultima Recurve Rest. Now again, this is a $50 rest. So I would recommend getting this rest. However, if you're on a budget, you could just go with a basic rest for now, and you could upgrade it in the future. But what I recommend is add it in, and if we exceed your budget when we get to the end, then these are the things you could come back and maybe penny pinch on. And again, these have got some cool colors, so we're going to go pink again, and because we're cool. So there we have it. We've got a bow, we've got a riser, limbs, string, button, spare rests, and a fancy rest. Next thing we're going to need is a clicker. So let's go grab a clicker. Now, as far as clickers go, they're not too fancy, guys. They go click, they screw onto your bow. There's a few options here, but what I recommend is just go with the straight biter clicker. They're not super expensive, and add one to your cart. You'll want the 632Z thread, and then go back to the archery shop. Okay, next we want a finger tab. Now, in terms of finger tabs, these things tend to be a little bit more personal. The best thing to do when choosing a finger tab is to ask around the archery club or ask around our team, coaching team or coaches or your mates or whoever, and actually try them on. You probably they won't like you shooting someone else's finger tab because it changes the crease in the leather. But even just trying it on and seeing how it fits in your hand and how it might affect your anchor is very worthwhile doing if possible. Couple of options that I would recommend. On a budget, this Cross & Zenia JM2 tab is not a bad design. So when you're looking at tabs, you're really buying a couple of things. You're buying the plate or the base of the tab, and then you're buying the leather. Now on the cheaper tabs here, they all have slightly different designs of the plate and slightly different leathers. The cheaper ones actually use cowhide leather, and the more expensive ones tend to use what's called cordovan. And that's made of a horse leather, and it's actually much better, it doesn't stretch or warp as much, and it's more durable. When you're just starting out, you may like to go with a leather tab, and you can upgrade that in the future. What I would recommend is go with a leather one for now, just to make sure that it actually works for you, and then you can upgrade, because you'll want a spare tab anyway as you move forward in your archery career. So it doesn't hurt to buy this one, and then upgrade in the future, and then retire this one and keep it as your spare. So we're going to do that at the moment. I'm going to buy one right hand medium tab. Of course, the hand size is something that is personal to you, and so you will have to figure that out for yourself. When it comes to tabs in terms of other options, I'll just flick through here a lot, guys. You'll notice that the tab we ordered is pretty much, it looks almost identical to this more expensive Vivix Seika 2 tab. And that's because it pretty much is identical in terms of the plate design, but this is the version that comes with a cordovan, much higher quality leather face of the tab. There's also other tabs in here which are a bit more adjustable, and again, it comes a lot down to personal preference and marketing. Okay, we've got our tab, and now we're going to get a sight. Sights. Now, the few things to do with sights, you can spend as little or as much as you like. At the cheaper end, what you're buying with a sight, well, the important thing with a sight is that it's a sight pin, and it's your aiming reference point. You want it to be adjustable, and you want it to hold its position and not move around on you. So there's actually some sights in this cheaper range that are more than adequate when it comes to that. I actually don't mind things like this Cartel Focus Carbon sight as a good entry-level option. So this is a pretty standard sight design. You got this zoomed in picture here. You can see that this has got a carbon extension, so it's not super heavy. And it's also got some functionality in terms of adjusting the rail. What you have to do is you have to loosen a couple of these screws, and then you can wind it up and down and have some micro adjustment functionality. Now, this sight is only about 50 bucks. So that's pretty good in terms of value for money, in my opinion. And with this sight, if you move on to, shooting national level competitions, that might be the time when it's worth upgrading it. But certainly for shooting local and state events, this would be more than adequate. Especially for the money, I think this is really good value. So the next thing to look at in sights in terms of upgrades from here is as you move up the price list, you'll start to notice that they have some better functionality in terms of the micro adjustments. So let's look at something like the Shibuya Activa carbon sight. And you can also look at this WNS SPR 200 sight. It's a bit of a mouthful. And if you look at these, you'll see that they have these little dials on the top and on the windage here that allows for easier micro adjustments. So small adjustments in the up and down and side to side movements. WNS has the same mechanism, up and down and side to side. It does make the sight heavier. And so if you were a slender build archer or a young archer, then this might be a little bit heavy on the bow if you're trying to keep it very light. But it does make it easier for those adjustments, and this is something that you could certainly shoot at a national level competition. And then as you move up the list in terms of cost and you get to the higher end sights, the price moves up a lot. So this WNS sight, for example, you're looking at around the $200 mark. But up at these expensive sights, for example, this Shibuya Ultima sight, this is the one I personally shoot, Really, really good build quality on this, and you're looking at about the $500 to $600 mark. So again, you could spend a lot of money on a good sight. But for us, what we're going to do now is we're going to add this one. We're going to add that WNS SPR 200 sight to our list. We're going to go one of them, right-handed, black, add to cart. There we have it. So let's close a couple of these tabs. Go back to our archery shop, see what's next. Next, we want a stabilizer. Now, a stabilizer, don't read all the marketing here, guys. Stabilizer is one of the most overpriced and over-marketed bits of archery kit. It is essentially a stick with a weight on the end. Now, you do want something with decent build quality. The cheaper ones tend to be kind of knocked together pretty lazily. But there's no need, I think, here to go with the top of the line option at all. It's not going to give you many points. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look for something that's just a decent build quality, but not super expensive. And something like this is probably more than adequate. The Cartel Supreme Long Rod. So this is a pretty good design. It's simply a carbon rod, and you can add your weights on the end. We're going to buy one long rod, and we're going to buy a 30 inches in black. So go for gold in terms of your colors, guys. Get creative, make it stand out on the shooting line, but always go for that 30-inch option. You don't want to go too short, otherwise you have to put too many weights on the long rod, and I think it's better to go with the 30-inch option. Particularly at the beginning, I recommend you start just with a single long rod to keep the bow weight light while you're learning technique. Adding the V-bars and the extender can come later, because about 85% of the stabilization is just from the long rod itself. And you'll only get the benefit of the V-bars once you're at a more advanced level. Price point for this one is around $50, and that's very, very reasonable. So let's add that to cart. So how we're looking so far? We're looking at around the $1,000 mark, and we've got quite a bit here. We've got the bow, the riser, the limbs, 2 strings. We've got a good pressure button. We've got some spare rest. We've got a good rest as well. We've got the clicker. We've got a tab. We've got a decent sight. We've got a decent long rod, and we're about $1,000. So we're starting to get pretty close to our full setup. Now, that's pretty much everything that goes on the bow. But we need some accessories, and we also need some of these suckers, some arrows. Mustn't forget them. Now, arrows again. As you go through your archery career, the things that you will have to upgrade most is your arrows and your limbs. It can be a bit painful for people when they think about arrows, because think of them as disposable. You use arrows, they'll break, you'll lose one occasionally. Don't get too precious with your arrows. They do break and things over time. So what we want here is an arrow that's good value, that's reasonable quality, but not super expensive, just when you're starting out. Once you get up to competition level at a sort of national level or higher, then it's worth spending some money on a better set of arrows. But when we're just starting out, there's actually some good options in a reasonable price bracket. So these carbon one shafts are pretty much the go-to. They're about $150 for a dozen, maybe $150 to $200 fully set up. And this is just the shaft. This is not all the components attached. Now, we're going to go with carbon ones in this package that we're looking at. But if you got to the end of your shopping cart and things are a bit expensive, another good option would be the Easton Apollo shafts. So let's find them here. Here they are. And basically, what you need to know here is that the Easton carbon ones and the Apollo shafts are the same arrow. Difference is the carbon one has a higher tolerance during the manufacturing process. So the ones that don't meet specification are rebranded as the Apollo shaft. So they're a cheaper version of the same shaft. For beginners, particularly when you're shooting bash about sets that you're planning on breaking, losing, smashing about, and upgrading very quickly, the Apollo shafts are more than sufficient, particularly when you're shooting just close distance. You might not even be able to tell the difference. So we're going to go with carbon ones, but again, no problem with going with Apollos. Quite a lot of my archers have shot these in the past and done quite well with them. So what you'll want is you'll want 1 dozen Don't make the mistake of ordering 12 dozen. That'll blow out your budget. The next thing to look at here is the size. Now, this is not the length. This is the spine or the stiffness of the arrow. So all these numbers here, what do they mean? Well, what we need to do is the spine is dependent on your draw length and also the draw weight, how heavy the bow is. And you want the arrow with the correct amount of flex in it so that it will fly straight. To determine the correct spine of the arrow that you need, we're going to head over to the Easton shaft selector chart. So if you just Google Easton target shaft selector, you'll be able to find this, but I'll also put a link to this somewhere in the description of this video. And there's all the details in here about how to read this chart and how to select the right ones, but I'm going to show you very quickly how it works. Okay, so what we're doing is you can see here that it tells you how to determine your draw length and everything like that. And I'm assuming by this stage you've talked to your coach or you've actually measured your draw length and you know what the correct draw length is. What we then do is we come to this arrow chart on the second page, this blue chart here. Whoops. Now on the first page, if you have a light draw length or a short draw length, for the younger people, then you can use this low poundage recurve bow chart. But for most people, you probably fall into this category. So remember, in this fictitious scenario, I'm going to assume you have a 28-inch draw length, and we chose 20-pound limbs. So you're in this probably lower bracket of bow weight. So you simply come in the chart here. Let me zoom in. So you can see here, 28 pounds. Bow weight for a recurve bow on the right-hand column is 21 to 27 pounds. And we end up in the T2 category. So now what we need to do is come down and find the T2 group, wherever that is. And we can see group T1, T2, and then this is our group for the shafts we're looking at. So let me just zoom in on that, and my computer's lagging a bit here. There we are. So under this T2 group, you can see that there's a size, spine, model, and weight of the shaft. And what we're interested in here, first of all, is the model. So what arrow are we looking at? You can see we have the Carbon 1 and the Apollo shaft. And then because we're looking at the Carbon 1 as our arrow, it would recommend us to use the spine 810. And if you were shooting the Apollos, you would take the 950. So that's it. We come over here, we put in 810. And then there's also some directions here. You can actually tell them to pre-cut your arrows to the correct length. Now, please read these instructions because it's not the overall arrow length. It is the inside of the nock to the end of the shaft, and then the point gets added onto the end of it. So in our scenario here, we've got 28-inch arrows or 28-inch draw length, but you have to add on the point weight, the point length at the end. So what we're going to assume here is, let's assume that the point length is 1/4 of an inch, and we're going to do 27.75 inches. Cut to suit, Easton G nocks. Okay, that way they will come cut to that length. Now it's very, very important when you're cutting anything, measure twice and cut once. And in this instance, you're asking someone else to cut it for you. So measure 3 times and then write it down and then check it twice. Okay, very important you get this number correct because that's how they come. And if you stuff it up, you'll get a set of useless arrows. If you are unsure about the length of your arrows, you can actually just order them uncut and just write uncut or leave these sections blank. And they'll send you a set of arrows from the factory uncut. And then you can take them to the local archery shop, or the archery club actually has an arrow saw, so you can get them cut at our archery club. And that's not a bad option because sometimes you're ordering your gear and you haven't quite found out your perfect draw length, or maybe you just don't know the length of the points that you're going to get, so you can't quite specify this with any accuracy. So that's fine, we can just leave them uncut, but in this instance, we know what it all is, so we're going to order them like that. Add to cart. Now that's our arrows, but we haven't yet got any components for those arrows. They're not very useful, just the shafts themselves. So the first thing we're going to need is some nocks over in this left-hand column. And I happen to know that with the carbon 1 arrows, they take Easton G nocks. So what we're going to look for here is the G nock. And these are the singular ones, but we're going to order some packs of a dozen. And we're going to order a dozen packs of a dozen. Again, these are pretty cheap. So for a dozen nocks, you're looking at $7. So always order multiple packs. Don't just order 12 because the nocks will break, get lost, whatever. And we're going to go with 3 dozen nocks. Now the G nocks tend to have a wider throat of the nock than most nocks. So we're going to go for a small groove. And you got all these funky colors you can choose from. So let's go with ruby. It's going to look pretty cool. And I'm going to go for the small groove. However, if you're shooting pin nocks or something else, you might go for the large groove nock. If you're unsure about how to choose that, then just speak to me or your coach or someone who knows what they're talking about. And then we'll go order 3 packs. Order at least 2 packs. Don't order 1, please. Add to cart. There we go. Now, what else do we need for some arrows? We're going to need some vanes and some points. So let's look at vanes first of all. Now, vanes, when you're just starting out, there's all kinds of different vanes you can get, but a simple glue-on tri-vane is what you'll want to go for. These AAE Elite Plastifletch vanes are probably the way to go, and the EP number you're looking at here is basically the size or the length of the vane. So EP16 just means that the length from the full length of the vane is 1.6 inches, essentially. We're going to get 1 pack of 100. That gives us plenty to fletch all of our arrows and some spares. And you've got more fancy colors. So we've got ruby nocks, and let's go for hot pink fletches. They will stand out, and add to cart. Now, if you choose, you can get 2 different color fletches and fletch an index vane onto your arrows. But generally, that's more for beginners because beginners need that different color to indicate which way to nock the arrow. Experienced archers will just know and figure out which way to nock it. So I suggest just getting 1 color, blending it with the pros. And the final thing we need for our arrow setup is we need a set of points. So down into this left-hand column again. And we're going to go some points. Now, you need to choose the right points for your shaft. You just can't fit any one in there because they're actually different diameters and things like that. So if you're unsure about which points to get, then you can go to the Easton Archery website and it will actually provide some guidance for the arrows you have to choose the points. So you can see here, we have Easton Apollo points, and it will tell you the weight of the point, so 70 grains, and it's for the spine of the arrow for that size and a dozen points. So what we're looking for is we're looking for the carbon 1 break-off points. That looks like them there. Easton carbon 1 break-off points, 1 dozen. So if we click on this, there we are. Now, you'll also see here that these break-off points, if you look at the picture here, you can see in the image that there's these 2 little separations in the back of the point. And this is why they're called break-offs. So if you order this size 90, 100, 110, that means that it comes as a 110 grain point. If you break this off, it becomes 100. And if you break that off, it becomes 90. So you can kind of custom make the point weight for your shaft. Now, there's some guidance on the Easton website as well about which point weight is right for your spine of arrow. However, from all the study we've done and the experimenting on aerodynamics and arrow mechanics, we know that generally a heavier point weight is better, especially in the wind. So there's no point going the heaviest point you can fit in your shaft, and we're going to go with that 90, 100, 110 point weight and add to cart. There we have it. So now we have our arrows set up, and the final thing we need to get is our tools and accessories. So first of all, let's go into tools. Okay, now when you assemble your arrows, the first thing you need is some glue. And this glue here is the one you want if you're using carbon 1 shafts. This blue glue is actually a hot melt. And so when you apply heat to this, it becomes soft, and then you'll use it to glue the points into the shaft. The blue one cools down at a lower temperature, which is good for carbon fiber arrows like the carbon ones. If you have an alloy shaft and you're gluing points into an alloy shaft, then you need to use a different type of glue. But for us, that's what we're going to be using. But that's not the only tool we need. We're going to go back to tools again. This is the one you would use if you're shooting an alloy shaft, by the way. Now, if you want to, you also need some glue to glue your fletchers onto the arrow shaft. So there's a couple of options here in terms of fletching glue. However, I personally use the Loctite gel super glue, which you can get from your Bunnings or your local hardware store. But if you want to buy it from here, you can get it from there. And it even has a fancy arrow label on it. But other than glue, a couple of other things you want. First, you'll want what's called a bow square. So click on the left-hand menu where it says bow square and buy one of these. Not expensive, but the bow square is important. It'll actually help you to measure your brace height and knocking point height, which is very important for maintaining and setting up your equipment. I have to go back to our tools section again. We're not done quite yet. And the next thing we have to do is, where's our tools menu? Here we are. We've got a bow square. The next thing we need is a fletching jig. Now, I insist with all my archers that they actually get a fletching jig, because otherwise it's up to me to maintain your arrows for you, and I'm not that kind of coach. You got to maintain your own gear. So I'm also lousy at fletching, so you'll be disappointed if I fletch your arrows for you. There's a few fletching jigs here, but the Cartel fletching jig is just your basic go-to jig, and it's very affordable, pretty cheap, and you'll want one of these. There we go. Back to our tools section. We're not done quite yet. You will also want a set of wrenches. Now, everything on your bow and archery, your sight, your stabilizers, your riser, your limb adjustment, your limb alignment, all that stuff, everything is set with Allen wrench keys. Now, when you buy your gear, they'll all come with loose keys, but in your quiver, you will absolutely want one of these, because you'll want everything attached in a logical way to the one little wrench set. So this is an essential bit of your archery kit that needs to be carried in your quiver at all times. Don't get caught out without one of those. And a final thing you'll want is, for tuning, you'll want a set of limb gauges. Now, to be honest, if you're pinching pennies here, you could just borrow a set from someone. But it's worth having these. They're a useful bit of kit to have as part of your setup. So make sure you get a recurve set, not a compound set, and add them to your cart. Now that, I think, will do it for tools, and now we're on to accessories. I'm assuming in this setup, by the way, that you have nothing. You have no gear whatsoever, and so you're buying everything. So let's go in first of all and get ourselves an arm guard. All kinds of arm guards here, guys. You got some beginner arm guards up the top there. I'm going to recommend a couple that you could use. You could use that. You could use that or that. You could use that or that. But let's get one of these biter arm guards because they're fashionable. And they come in all kinds of colors. So let's pick a light green one, which is going to match our riser. I think we chose green riser and the pink accessories. Add that to cart. Okay, that's our arm guard. The next thing we'll want is probably a quiver. So again, quivers, you have a bit of personal selection here. You can use your personal flair. The main thing for your quiver is you'll want plenty of pockets on it to store your accessories like your arm guard, finger tabs, notebooks and stuff. And you'll want tubes that separate the arrows in your quiver. So you can get different styles. You can spend as much money as you like. There's some fancy leather type quivers there. Something like this is probably as good a value as you get. It has all the pockets you could hope for, and they come in some cool colors, as you can see. So let's get one of these legend quivers. They're only $22, which is pretty cool. And we're going to get a right-handed purple one. Okay, back into our accessories. We're not done quite yet. We've got an arm guard. We've got a quiver. You might want an arrow puller. Now, this is just an accessory that helps you pull arrows out. If your archery club has good targets, like we generally have, then you might get away without this, but otherwise, sometimes it's really difficult to pull your arrows out of the butt. And you can hurt your hands, or you can actually bend the shaft if you're not careful. So it's worth getting one of these little devices. Heaps of, things in here. You don't need to get super creative or spend a lot of money. You can simply use a little bit of rubber if you don't have one of these, but let's add one to our cart for the purposes of being complete. Now, as for accessories, there's a few more things we need here. You will definitely want a bow stand. Now, as far as bow stands go, there's a few different types. There's a few cheap ones there, but they tend to be a little bit brittle and not very robust. So this is the one that I use. Highly recommend it. Light, easy to fold up, and pretty robust. I've had mine for a couple of years now. So you can start to see, we're getting all of these items add up, and there's quite a bit you need to add to your list. So the next thing you will need as far as the accessories go is a bow stringer. Now this helps you to string your bow safely. As far as these go, they're only a few dollars, and you don't need to get the most expensive one. If you can string a bow, you can string a bow. So let's add one of them to our cart. Back to the archery shop. Back to accessories. Next, we want a chest guard. Now, don't really care who you are. You should have a chest guard as part of your kit. If you're wearing like the Rogue Archery jersey or a shooting shirt that's fitted to your body, then you might get away without one of these. However, most of the jerseys they give you, particularly if you're part of a state or national or club team or whatever it is, are not that fitted and they're not that tight fitting. And so the string can interfere with your shirt, and that you'll definitely want one of these arm guards. Again, I don't care which one you get. You just want one that fits you. We're just going to go with a basic Cartel one. We're going to want a medium one. Obviously, order to your relevant size. The other thing that's relevant with choosing a chest guard is it does help if you can try one on around the club and make sure that it's actually going to fit you. Okay, other accessories. I think we've almost got everything we need there. We've got our chest guard, we've got our bow stringer, we've got our bow stand, we've got a quiver, and we've got our arm guard. So one of the last things we're going to need is a case. Now there's all kinds of cases you can get. You can get hard cases or soft cases, but when you're just starting out, one of these bow bags is probably the way to go. These bow bags are fantastic because you can pretty much pack up almost everything that you're ordering in terms of your bow, your arrows, your tools, all the accessories into one convenient to carry thing. So you can chuck it in the car, carry it around after school, whatever you need to do. Even if you have to catch the bus out to archery, it's pretty easy to transport. Everything's packed up in a neat little way. So definitely get one of these cases. I don't care which one you get. You can spend as much money or get the fashionable one you like. Some of them have got some fancy patterns on them. But again, these basic ones are still pretty good. So I reckon these legend ones are probably good value for money. So let's add one of them to kit and get a fancy color so we're not going to lose it. And yeah, these are pretty good. Only about $60, which is pretty good considering the build quality of these. Now, how are we looking in terms of price? So in terms of price, we're up around the $1,500 mark. That's pretty good for everything we've got here. Keeping in mind that we haven't gone the cheapest, I think if you downgraded some of the basic items, like your riser and your sight, and your plunger and your rest, this would be much more closer to $1,000 to $1,200. If you spend much less than that, you start to get to a stage where you're starting to kind of compromise on fundamentals. And as you progress, that's not necessarily a problem. I mean, you've got to work within your budget. That's totally okay. But it just means that if you progress and you start to get competitive, which is obviously the goal, then you might have to upgrade more stuff as you go along. So what we've got here is something that I think would be great for a beginning archer, but it also sets a really good benchmark for things that as you develop, you would be able to actually build on this and upgrade, limbs and arrows, for example. And then this setup could basically take you through to, shooting at a national level with most of this equipment, with just new limbs and arrows upgraded as you go along. Don't forget to add and factor in the price of shipping. The other thing to acknowledge when you're adding this section up is if the order comes over $1,000, you could be up for import tax. What some people will want to do then is they'll actually split the order up into 2 orders. I'm not giving you any tax advice here, don't mistake me. But if you split the order up so that each package is less than $1,000 in gross value, then some people get away with not paying the import tax and having their baggage held up at customs. So I think that can sometimes be worth paying the slightly extra postage just to make sure that that makes sense. And if you do that, then I would recommend putting all the big items together and then all the accessories in a separate package, just so that from a shipping point of view, it kind of makes sense. So let's just review this and make sure we haven't forgotten anything important. There may be a few little things we could add to this order. We've got a riser, we've got a limbs, we've got 2 strings, we've got a Shibuya plunger, which is a good plunger, we've got some spare rests and a good rest, we've got a clicker, we've got a tab, we've got a sight, stabilizer long rod, we've got arrows, we've got shafts, nocks, vanes, points, we've got some glue for our points, we've got a bow square, we've got a Cartel Fletching jig for fletching our arrows, we've got an Allen wrench for all our accessories, we've got some limb gauges, arm guard, quiver, arrow puller, we've got a bow stand, bow stringer, a chest guard, and we've got a backpack. Now there's a couple of things we can add to this that I think we missed. When you order your sight, it is worth ordering a spare sight pin. So look in the menu over here. If you click on sight pins, buy a couple of spare sight pins. I recommend something simple and round like this. They're only a couple of dollars. And that just means that sometimes the sight pins that come with the sight aren't the ones you like, or they can sometimes break. They're not that expensive to replace, but you don't want to be caught out with a broken sight and nothing to replace it with. So it's worth having a spare one in your kit. The other thing that's worth adding here is some knocking point material. So we look at the knocking point material. I think I clicked on the wrong thing there. We actually want serving material. And something like this, just some knocking point thread is just some nylon thread. And if you order one of these, I don't care what color you choose, that's worth having in your kit because you can also make your own knocking points with that. And the final thing is you'll want some string wax. And as I always say, you should wax your string not as often as you wax your legs, but more often than you wax your coach's car. So because you're using a synthetic string material, choose this type of string wax and add one of them to cart. Now, waxing a string just makes the string a bit more resilient to moisture and a little bit more harder wearing. So again, those couple of items haven't added much in terms of cost, but they're worth having as part of your kit. The other thing you may wish to add to your order that's worth talking about is for your stabilizer. So you've got the long rod, and I think that comes with a weight, for example, but you may want to add what's called a damper. Now these dampers are little rubber dampers, they're little rubber things that screw in between the long rod and its weights. And at the moment of the shot and the release, there's actually quite a bit of vibration going through the bow. So these little dampers just help to dampen that vibration and stop it from rattling the bow loose too often. Again, not very expensive, but worth adding one to your kit. If something is sold out, that's not necessarily a big issue with this particular supplier, because that just means that they'll just ship it to you when it comes in stock, and they're usually getting new supplies every couple of weeks. And the other thing with stabilizers is if you do require extra weights, all that stuff is in here as well. So you can look for weights and you can find the particular weight that fits your stabilizer. They usually have a pretty common thread, but the diameter of the weight might be slightly different, so you can shop around for that on your own time. But there we have it, guys. Let's look at our cart, see where we're up to. I think we're about the $1,500 mark, a little bit shy. $1,500 if you allow enough money to buy your coach dinner. Hint, hint. And yeah, if you have any questions, what I recommend if you're part of my team is that you actually go ahead and put together a shopping list like this. Then take a screen print or copy that to me and email me. What I'll do is I'll just have a quick look over and make sure you haven't forgotten anything important, or maybe you've chosen a few different items in here based on the shopping list. That's totally fine. I'll just double check it, make sure you haven't made any obvious mistakes, and then you can go and order it. And whether you order it from these guys or whether you take your shopping list into one of the local suppliers and ask them to fill it, depending on the shop, they may not have exactly this full range, but they might be able to recommend some alternatives. Just it's worth knowing what you're doing if you're going into an archery shop and having a prescribed shopping list. That being said, guys, I hope you got a lot out of this video. If you do have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Peace out.